March 1961, Miami Beach, Florida. The Fontainebleau Hotel rose 17 stories above Collins Avenue, its distinctive curved facade representing the pinnacle of resort luxury in an era when Miami Beach attracted the wealthiest and most glamorous visitors from across America and around the world. The hotel's La Ronde Room was among the most prestigious performance venues in the South, hosting entertainers whose fame drew audiences willing to pay prices that reflected both the quality of the talent and the exclusivity of the setting. Frank Sinatra had been booked for a 2-week engagement that was expected to generate revenue exceeding anything the venue had previously produced. His drawing power sufficient to fill the 1,200-seat showroom for every performance, while also attracting guests who would occupy the hotel's rooms and patronize its restaurants and bars throughout his residency. The contractual arrangements had been negotiated over months, the fees and accommodations reflecting Frank's status as the most bankable entertainer in America. The band that accompanied Frank on this engagement included 23 musicians whose skills had been honed through years of professional performance and whose presence was essential to the sonic landscape that distinguished his live shows from anything that lesser artists could produce. The arrangements they performed had been crafted specifically for this ensemble. Their instrumentation and their chemistry, creating something that could not be replicated by substitute musicians regardless of how talented those substitutes might be. Among these 23 musicians were 4 black men whose talents had earned them positions that their race might otherwise have made impossible during an era when integration in professional music remained incomplete despite progress that had occurred over the preceding decades. These 4 included 2 trumpet players, a trombonist, and a percussionist whose contributions to the band's sound were integral rather than decorative, their presence reflecting Frank's insistence on hiring the best musicians available regardless of their skin color. The trouble began on the afternoon of the first performance day, when the band members arrived at the Fontainebleau to check into the rooms that had been reserved as part of the engagement's contractual terms. The white musicians were processed efficiently, their keys provided, and their luggage directed to accommodations that met the standards the hotel's reputation promised. The 4 black musicians were directed to wait, while the front desk staff consulted with management about a situation that apparently required authorization beyond what the clerks possessed. The consultation produced a decision that the hotel's assistant manager delivered with the clinical detachment of someone communicating policy rather than expressing personal opinion. The black musicians would not be permitted to stay at the Fontainebleau, the hotel's policies regarding Negro guests being clear and non-negotiable, regardless of what arrangements might have been made by booking agents who should have understood the establishment's standards before committing to terms that could not be honored. The assistant manager offered what he apparently considered a reasonable accommodation. The black musicians could stay at a hotel in the Overtown neighborhood, Miami's designated area for Negro residents and visitors, and transportation would be provided to bring them to the Fontainebleau for performances and rehearsals. The arrangement was presented as generous, given that it exceeded what many Southern establishments would have offered, the provision of transportation representing consideration that some might have deemed unnecessary. The white musicians who witnessed this exchange reacted with anger that the assistant manager seemed not to have anticipated, their solidarity with their black colleagues exceeding what segregationist assumptions about racial dynamics might have predicted. The band's conductor, a veteran musician whose decades of experience had included countless encounters with discrimination against colleagues, demanded to speak with the hotel's general manager about a situation that he declared unacceptable regardless of whatever policies the establishment maintained. The general manager, a man named Harrison Whitfield, whose authority over the Fontainebleau's operations was second only to the property's owners, arrived at the front desk with an expression that suggested annoyance at being summoned to address a matter that his subordinates should have been capable of handling. His assessment of the situation produced no modification of the position his assistant manager had communicated. The hotel's policies were clear, had been established long before this engagement was booked, and would not be altered to accommodate musicians whose presence as overnight guests would disturb other patrons whose expectations the Fontainebleau was obligated to meet. The band's conductor warned Whitfield that Frank Sinatra would not accept this treatment of his musicians and that the engagement might be cancelled if the situation was not resolved in a manner that allowed all band members to stay at the hotel, as the contract had specified. The warning was delivered with conviction that reflected genuine understanding of Frank's values, rather than mere speculation about how he might respond. Whitfield's response revealed contempt that his professional demeanor had initially concealed. He informed the conductor that entertainers came and went while the Fontainebleau's reputation remained, that no performer was so important that the hotel would compromise standards that had been established to protect the comfort of guests whose ongoing patronage mattered more than any single engagement, and that if Mr. Sinatra wished to cancel his performances, the hotel would survive the disappointment, while his reputation for unreliability would follow him throughout his career. The threat was delivered with the confidence of someone who believed that economic power resided with the institution rather than the individual, that the Fontainebleau's prestige exceeded anything a mere entertainer could command, and that Frank Sinatra needed the hotel more than the hotel needed him. The miscalculation was comprehensive and would prove catastrophic. Before continuing with this investigation, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened at the Fontainebleau Hotel in March 1961 involves one of the most dramatic confrontations between celebrity power and institutional racism in American entertainment history. A hotel manager who thought he could segregate Frank Sinatra's band without consequence, and a response that made national news and changed how the hospitality industry treated black musicians forever. By the end of this story, you will understand why Harrison Whitfield lost his job, why the Fontainebleau changed its policies, and why Frank Sinatra's loyalty to his musicians became legendary. Francis Albert Sinatra learned about the situation within an hour of its occurrence, the band's conductor having reached him by telephone at the airport where his private plane had just landed, following the flight from Los Angeles. The information was delivered with urgency that reflected understanding of how Frank would respond and awareness that decisions would need to be made quickly if the evening's performance was to proceed. Frank's reaction was immediate and unequivocal. He would not perform at any venue that refused to accommodate members of his band, and he would not accept any compromise that involved his black musicians staying at a separate facility while their white colleagues enjoyed the accommodations that the contract had guaranteed for everyone. The position was not negotiable, and the conductor was authorized to communicate it to hotel management in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. The call that followed to Harrison Whitfield was brief and direct, Frank delivering personally the message that his conductor had been authorized to convey. He informed the general manager that the engagement was suspended effective immediately, that no performances would occur until all members of his band were accommodated at the Fontainebleau under the same terms and in the same quality of rooms as the white musicians, and that if this condition was not met within 2 hours, the engagement would be cancelled entirely, and the hotel would be responsible for refunding every ticket that had been sold. Whitfield's response attempted to call what he apparently believed was a bluff, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who could not imagine that any entertainer would sacrifice the income and exposure that a Fontainebleau engagement provided over the sleeping arrangements of 4 musicians whose replacement would presumably be simple if their continued employment proved inconvenient. He suggested that Frank reconsider his position before making decisions that could not be easily reversed. Frank's reply was delivered with a calm that witnesses would later describe as more frightening than any anger might have been. He told Whitfield that his position was not subject to reconsideration, that the 2-hour deadline was firm, and that when it expired without resolution, the cancellation would be announced to media, whose interest in the story would generate coverage extending far beyond the entertainment pages to encompass the broader issues of discrimination that the incident represented. The mention of media coverage introduced a dimension that Whitfield had apparently not adequately considered. The Fontainebleau's reputation depended on an image of sophisticated glamour that association with overt racism could severely damage, particularly among the northern tourists whose spending constituted a significant portion of the hotel's revenue. The calculation that had seemed straightforward when applied to 4 musicians became considerably more complex when applied to the national publicity that Frank Sinatra's involvement would guarantee. The 2 hours that followed were consumed by frantic consultations between Whitfield and the hotel's owners, conversations whose content was never fully revealed, but whose outcome demonstrated that economic considerations had ultimately prevailed over whatever principles the segregation policy had been intended to serve. The decision to accommodate Frank's demands was made with approximately 20 minutes remaining before the deadline he had imposed. The call informing Frank of the hotel's capitulation was received without celebration, his response making clear that the resolution was minimum compliance rather than something deserving of gratitude. He demanded that the black musicians receive not merely accommodation, but apology, that the assistant manager, who had initially delivered the rejection, be removed from their site for the duration of the engagement, and that the general manager personally escort them to their rooms with acknowledgement that the hotel's initial response had been wrong. Whitfield resisted the demand for personal escort and apology, his pride rebelling against requirements that would require him to humble himself before musicians, whose race he apparently considered sufficient justification for the treatment they had initially received. The resistance lasted until Frank made clear that performance remained contingent on compliance, and that the deadline, though extended, would not be extended indefinitely. The scene that unfolded in the Fontainebleau lobby an hour later was witnessed by guests and staff, whose observations would fuel stories that spread through Miami Beach within hours and through the entertainment industry within days. Harrison Whitfield, general manager of one of the most prestigious hotels in America, personally escorted 4 black musicians to their rooms while apologizing for the treatment they had received and assuring them that their stay would meet the standards that all Fontainebleau guests were entitled to expect. The apology was stilted and clearly reluctant, Whitfield's words communicating compliance rather than genuine contrition. But the fact of the apology mattered more than its sincerity, the public nature of his submission demonstrating that power sufficient to override the hotel's discriminatory policies existed and had been successfully exercised on behalf of people who would normally have had no recourse against such treatment. The black musicians accepted the apology with dignity that exceeded what the situation required, their composure reflecting understanding that the victory they had just witnessed was larger than any personal satisfaction they might derive from watching a racist humble himself. Their rooms proved to be among the finest the hotel offered, their treatment for the remainder of the engagement exceeding what any of them had experienced at comparable establishments. Frank arrived at the hotel several hours later, his entrance attracting attention from guests who recognized him and from staff who understood that the events of the afternoon had established new parameters for how this particular entertainer and those associated with him would be treated. His first action upon arrival was to visit the rooms of his black musicians, confirming personally that their accommodations were satisfactory and that no further problems had arisen since the earlier confrontation. The visit was witnessed by hotel staff, whose reports to management communicated that Frank's attention to this matter would not diminish now that the immediate crisis had been resolved. His commitment to his musicians' welfare was not performative, but genuine, rooted in values that the afternoon's events had merely provided opportunity to demonstrate rather than creating from nothing. The performance that evening was delivered to an audience that included many guests who had heard about the day's events and whose appreciation for Frank's artistry was enhanced by awareness of his character. The music was exceptional, the band performing with an energy that reflected their awareness of what had been done on their behalf and their determination to justify the faith that Frank had demonstrated through his willingness to sacrifice a lucrative engagement rather than accept their mistreatment. The standing ovation that concluded the performance acknowledged both the artistic achievement and the moral stance that had preceded it, audience members rising to applaud an entertainer whose actions that afternoon had proven that his values extended beyond the self-interest that characterized so many of his peers. The response was overwhelming, even by the standards of Frank Sinatra performances, its duration and intensity communicating appreciation that transcended mere entertainment. The media coverage that followed, exceeded even what Frank had threatened during his confrontation with Whitfield. Journalists recognizing in the incident a story that connected entertainment industry glamour to civil rights struggles that were transforming American society. The major newspapers covered the confrontation, their accounts emphasizing Frank's refusal to perform unless his musicians were treated equally, and the hotel's eventual capitulation to demands that it had initially rejected. The coverage framed the incident as a victory for integration that demonstrated the power celebrities could exercise when they chose to deploy their influence on behalf of causes larger than their own interests. Frank was portrayed as a hero, whose loyalty to his musicians had forced one of America's most exclusive hotels to modify policies that had been enforced for years without significant challenge. The Fontainebleau's reputation suffered damage that the hotel's owners had hoped to avoid by eventually complying with Frank's demands, the publicity that accompanied the resolution, ensuring that the initial discrimination would be remembered long after the apology that had followed it. The association with racism proved difficult to dispel despite subsequent efforts to present the hotel as welcoming to guests of all races. Harrison Whitfield's tenure as general manager ended within months of the incident, his departure attributed officially to personal reasons, but understood throughout the industry as a consequence of the publicity disaster he had created through his handling of the situation. The miscalculation that had led him to believe that institutional power could override a celebrity's leverage had proven professionally fatal. The entertainment industry absorbed lessons from the incident about the power that performers could exercise when they chose solidarity with their musicians over acceptance of arrangements that treated some members of their ensembles as less worthy of respect than others. Frank's example was not universally followed, but it established a precedent that subsequent artists would invoke when they encountered similar situations. The four black musicians whose treatment had triggered the confrontation continued performing with Frank throughout his career, their positions secure not merely because of their talent, but because of the bond that the Fontainebleau incident had created. They understood that their employer had sacrificed a significant engagement to defend their dignity, a gesture whose value exceeded any salary or bonus that mere employment could provide. The relationships between Frank and these musicians deepened in the years that followed, their professional connection evolving into something approaching personal friendship that transcended the boundaries that typically separated stars from the people who supported their performances. Frank remembered their names, inquired about their families, and treated them with respect that musicians of their race did not always receive from white band leaders, regardless of the progressive politics those band leaders might espouse. The Miami Beach hospitality industry was affected by the incident in ways that extended beyond the Fontainebleau's immediate policy changes. Other hotels recognized that similar confrontations could occur if they maintained discriminatory practices that visiting entertainers might refuse to accept, and the economic calculations that had governed racial policies were reconsidered in light of evidence that the costs of discrimination could exceed whatever benefits it might provide. The progress that resulted was incomplete and contested, Miami Beach's integration proceeding gradually, rather than through any single transformative moment. But the Fontainebleau incident contributed to momentum that would eventually produce changes that seemed impossible when Frank had first demanded that his musicians be treated equally, each victory building on previous ones until the cumulative effect became difficult to resist. The band members who had been at the center of the incident spoke about it for the remainder of their careers, their accounts preserving details that might otherwise have been lost as memories faded and as new generations arrived without direct knowledge of what had occurred. Their stories emphasized both Frank's intervention and the broader context of discrimination that had made such intervention necessary. The trumpet player who had been most senior among the four black musicians eventually wrote a memoir that devoted an entire chapter to the Fontainebleau incident, his account providing details that news coverage had not captured and perspectives that only someone who had experienced the discrimination firsthand could offer. The chapter became one of the book's most discussed sections, its narrative demonstrating the personal impact of both the initial humiliation and the subsequent vindication. Frank's response to the memoir was characteristically deflective, his public comments emphasizing that he had simply done what anyone should have done, and that the musicians deserved credit for their professionalism rather than for their willingness to endure discrimination that should never have been imposed. The modesty was genuine but also somewhat misleading, his actions having exceeded what most people in his position would have been willing to undertake. The civil rights movement that was transforming American society during this period received support from the Fontainebleau incident that extended beyond its immediate participants. The story demonstrated that integration could be forced by economic pressure applied strategically, that institutions dependent on celebrity participation could be compelled to modify policies that direct protest might not have been able to change. The musicians who benefited from Frank's intervention became advocates for similar action by other performers, their experience providing evidence that solidarity could produce results that individual complaints could never achieve. They spoke at industry gatherings about the importance of entertainers supporting the people who made their performances possible, using their own story as illustration of what became possible when stars recognized their obligations to those who worked for them. The Fontainebleau eventually became one of Miami Beach's integrated hotels, its policies having evolved through a combination of legal requirements and economic incentives that made discrimination increasingly untenable. The transformation occurred gradually enough that the connection to the 1961 incident became obscured, but those who knew the history understood that Frank's confrontation with Harrison Whitfield had been among the factors that had pushed the establishment toward changes that seemed impossible before they occurred. The documentation of the incident was preserved in newspaper archives and in personal collections maintained by participants whose awareness of the historical significance of what had occurred led them to retain materials that might otherwise have been discarded. Researchers who later studied the entertainment industry's role in civil rights struggles found in these materials evidence of how celebrity power had been deployed in service of causes that transcended individual careers. The band that performed at the Fontainebleau during that March 1961 engagement remained together for several more years, their unity strengthened by shared experience of the discrimination they had faced and the victory they had achieved through Frank's intervention. The chemistry they had developed through years of performing together was enhanced by bonds that extended beyond professional collaboration to encompass genuine mutual respect. Frank's subsequent engagements in Miami Beach included contractual provisions, specifically addressing the treatment of his musicians, language that guaranteed their accommodation in the same facilities where he would stay, and that provided for cancellation without penalty if these terms were violated. The provisions were rarely invoked because their existence ensured compliance that might otherwise have required enforcement. The hospitality industry's evolution continued through the 1960s, legal requirements eventually establishing integration mandates that individual incidents like the Fontainebleau confrontation had anticipated. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made discrimination in public accommodations illegal, formalizing through legislation what Frank had demanded through economic leverage 3 years earlier. The precedent that the incident established influenced how contracts were negotiated throughout the entertainment industry. Artists and their representatives increasingly including provisions that protected the treatment of musicians and support staff whose race or other characteristics might otherwise have exposed them to discrimination. The practice became standard enough that its origins in specific incidents like the Fontainebleau confrontation were sometimes forgotten. Frank's reputation as someone who would defend his musicians at significant personal cost became part of how he was understood within the industry, attracting talented performers who valued working for someone whose loyalty could be relied upon and whose principles extended beyond rhetoric to encompass action. The quality of the musicians who performed with him reflected this reputation, their presence enhancing performances that might otherwise have been merely excellent rather than extraordinary. The 4 black musicians who had been at the center of the incident experienced the remainder of their careers with security that the Fontainebleau victory had established. They understood that Frank's intervention had transformed not merely their immediate circumstances, but their ongoing relationship with an industry that had historically treated black musicians as interchangeable commodities whose individual dignity mattered less than their instrumental capabilities. Their children and grandchildren grew up knowing the story, a family legend that connected them to entertainment history while also teaching lessons about character that transcended the specific circumstances of the incident. The narrative emphasized both Frank's heroism and the broader struggles for equality that the incident represented, situating individual action within collective movements whose achievements made such action possible. The Fontainebleau Hotel continues to operate on Collins Avenue, its iconic facade preserved through renovations that have modernized the property while maintaining its historic character. The guests who occupy its rooms today are diverse in ways that would have been impossible under the policies that Harrison Whitfield attempted to enforce in 1961. Their presence representing progress that the confrontation with Frank Sinatra had helped to catalyze. The La Ronde room where Frank performed during that engagement has been renamed and repurposed multiple times, its current configuration bearing little resemblance to the showroom where audiences watched an entertainer whose actions that afternoon had demonstrated values that his artistry alone could not have communicated. The physical space has been transformed, but the history it contains survives in documentation that researchers continue to examine. The story of what happened at the Fontainebleau in March 1961 remains relevant as an example of how individual action can advance collective causes, how economic leverage can produce changes that moral arguments alone cannot achieve, and how the character that emerges in moments of crisis reveals values that ordinary circumstances might conceal. The lessons extend far beyond the specific participants to encompass broader questions about power, solidarity, and the obligations that those with influence carry toward those without. Frank Sinatra's willingness to sacrifice a significant engagement to defend four musicians whose race had made them targets of discrimination demonstrated something essential about who he was beneath the persona that his performances projected. The loyalty he showed was not calculated for public relations benefit, but emerged from values that his upbringing had instilled and that his experiences had reinforced through decades of witnessing injustice that his position allowed him to address when circumstances provided opportunity. The national news coverage that the incident generated communicated Frank's values to audiences far beyond those who attended his performances, establishing his reputation as someone whose commitment to equality extended beyond words to encompass action that carried real costs. The coverage contributed to a public image that combined artistic excellence with moral courage, each dimension enhancing appreciation for the other. The musicians whose dignity he defended that day never forgot what he had done, their gratitude expressed through decades of professional excellence that justified the faith he had demonstrated in their worth. The relationship between entertainer and musicians that the incident revealed was one of mutual respect rather than mere employment, a partnership in which each party recognized the value of the other and acted accordingly when circumstances demanded. The telephone call that Frank had made from the airport had set in motion a confrontation whose stakes exceeded what either party might have anticipated when the conversation began. His voice had carried authority that derived not from any official position, but from understanding of his own value to the hotel's business model and willingness to sacrifice that value rather than accept treatment that his principles could not tolerate. The assistant manager, who had initially delivered the rejection to the black musicians, found his own position affected by the incident's fallout, his role in enforcing policies that had produced such damaging publicity, marking him as someone whose judgment could not be trusted in situations requiring sensitivity. His departure from the Fontainebleau followed Whitfield's by several weeks, his career in hospitality management effectively ended by association with decisions that his superiors had been forced to reverse. The band's conductor, whose warning to Whitfield had been dismissed as bluff, found his own reputation enhanced by the incident's outcome. His accurate prediction of how Frank would respond demonstrated understanding of the entertainer's character that years of professional collaboration had developed, and his willingness to confront hotel management on behalf of colleagues revealed leadership qualities that extended beyond musical direction. The white musicians who had witnessed their black colleagues' initial rejection and who had expressed solidarity before Frank's intervention arrived, experienced the incident as confirmation of values they had brought to their careers. The music industry's gradual integration had produced ensembles whose members understood that talent transcended racial categories, and the Fontainebleau incident validated their belief that solidarity across racial lines was both morally correct and practically effective. The rehearsal that preceded the evening's performance was charged with energy that reflected the emotional intensity of the day's events. The musicians played with precision and passion that communicated their awareness of what had been done on behalf of some among them, their collective excellence serving as tribute to an employer whose loyalty had been tested and proven during the hours before they took the stage. Frank's demeanor during the rehearsal was focused, but also warmer than his typical pre-performance mood, his interactions with the musicians carrying appreciation for the situation they had navigated together. He made a point of speaking individually with each of the four whose treatment had triggered the confrontation, his words private, but his body language communicating support that the entire ensemble could observe. The audience that evening included guests whose awareness of the day's events varied from detailed knowledge to complete ignorance, their responses to the performance reflecting whatever understanding they brought to an evening that was on its surface merely entertainment. But those who knew what had occurred heard something additional in music that carried the weight of the afternoon's confrontation. The reviews that appeared in the following day's newspapers praised the performance in terms that matched the most enthusiastic assessments Frank had ever received, critics recognizing excellence that the circumstances had perhaps enhanced rather than created. The technical achievements were notable, but the emotional resonance that infused the evening's music reflected dimensions that pure technique could not have produced. The remaining performances of the engagement proceeded without incident, the hotel's staff having absorbed lessons about how this particular entertainer expected to be treated, and how his expectations extended to everyone associated with his productions. The deference that Fontainebleau employees displayed toward the band reflected awareness that any mistreatment would reach Frank's attention and would produce consequences that no one wished to experience. The black musicians found their accommodations exceeded expectations that their previous experiences with Southern hotels had established, the staff apparently having received instructions to ensure that no complaint could possibly arise from their treatment. The overcorrection was awkward, but preferable to the alternative, their comfort during the engagement providing evidence that the confrontation had produced results beyond the immediate crisis. The tips that Frank distributed at the engagement's conclusion exceeded his typical generosity, the amounts reflecting appreciation for the band's performance during circumstances that had tested everyone's professionalism. The musicians understood that the money acknowledged what they had endured and how they had responded, their conduct during the crisis having justified faith that the incident had demonstrated. The relationships that had been strengthened by the shared experience persisted long after the Miami engagement concluded. The musicians who had been at the center of the confrontation, maintaining connections with Frank that extended beyond professional collaboration. They were invited to events that mere employment would not have warranted, their presence reflecting a bond that the Fontainebleau incident had created. The documentation of what had occurred was preserved through multiple channels, the newspaper coverage providing a public record, while personal correspondence and interviews captured dimensions that journalism could not fully convey. The musicians themselves maintained records that included photographs and written accounts whose details supplemented what the press had reported. The civil rights organizations that learned of the incident incorporated it into their advocacy, the story demonstrating that economic pressure applied by sympathetic allies could achieve results that direct protest might not have produced. The lesson was specific to circumstances that could not be universally replicated, but it was also general enough to inform strategy in other contexts where similar dynamics might apply. The entertainment industry's relationship with the civil rights movement was illustrated by the incident in ways that both parties found valuable. Celebrities recognizing opportunities to contribute beyond donations, and activists recognizing potential allies whose influence could be strategically deployed. The collaboration that developed produced results that neither group could have achieved independently. Frank's subsequent appearances in Miami Beach were characterized by contractual provisions that specifically addressed the treatment of his musicians. The Fontainebleau incident, having established the necessity of such protections, even at venues that might not have maintained discriminatory policies. The provisions became standard in his contracts regardless of location, the experience having demonstrated that assumptions about equal treatment could not be safely made. The other hotels on Collins Avenue observed the Fontainebleau's experience and drew conclusions that influenced their own policies, the publicity disaster that Whitfield had created, serving as warning about consequences that discrimination could produce when the people being discriminated against had connections to celebrities whose involvement would attract media attention. The calculations that governed racial policies were reconsidered in light of risks that the incident had illustrated. The progress that resulted was uneven and incomplete. Miami Beach's integration proceeding through a combination of legal requirements, economic pressures, and changing attitudes that the Fontainebleau incident had contributed to without single-handedly producing. The transformation occurred gradually enough that its connection to specific catalysts became obscured, but those who studied the history understood that Frank's confrontation with Whitfield had been among the factors that had accelerated change. The band that performed at the Fontainebleau remained Frank's preferred ensemble for years afterward, their chemistry and their shared history making them irreplaceable regardless of whatever talented alternatives might have been available. The musicians understood that their positions were secure not merely because of their skills, but because of the bond that the incident had created, a loyalty that had been demonstrated through action rather than merely expressed through words. The children of the four black musicians grew up knowing the story of what had happened at the Fontainebleau, a family legend that connected them to entertainment history, while also teaching lessons about dignity that transcended the specific circumstances of the incident. The narrative was told and retold at gatherings where elder generations shared experiences with younger ones, preserving knowledge that formal education might not have provided. The grandchildren who eventually heard the story encountered it in a world transformed by progress that the incident had helped to catalyze, their difficulty comprehending the discrimination their grandparents had faced, reflecting how thoroughly circumstances had changed. The gap between their experience and what the story described illustrated both the progress that had occurred and the distance that remained to be traveled. The memoir that one of the musicians eventually published devoted significant attention to the Fontainebleau incident, his account providing details that supplemented what newspapers had reported and perspectives that only someone who had experienced the discrimination firsthand could offer. The chapter became widely discussed among readers whose interest in civil rights history led them to seek first-hand accounts. Frank's response to questions about the incident during interviews conducted later in his career was characteristically deflective, his comments emphasizing that he had simply done what anyone should have done and that the musicians deserved recognition for their professionalism rather than for their willingness to endure discrimination. The modesty concealed awareness that his actions had exceeded what most in his position would have undertaken. The entertainment industry's evolution regarding treatment of black musicians continued through the 1960s and beyond, legal protections eventually formalizing through legislation what Frank had demanded through economic leverage in 1961. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made discrimination in public accommodations illegal, but the cultural transformation that made such legislation enforceable required countless individual actions like Frank's that demonstrated consequences for violations. The hospitality industry's relationship with the entertainment world was permanently affected by the incident, hotels understanding that their treatment of musicians and support staff could attract publicity that would damage their reputations far more than accommodating integrated ensembles might disturb guests whose prejudices some establishments had previously catered to. The economic calculations shifted as evidence accumulated that discrimination carried costs that exceeded whatever benefits it might provide. The story of what happened at the Fontainebleau has been retold in biographies, documentaries, and academic studies that examine the entertainment industry's role in civil rights struggles. Each retelling introduces variations that reflect the perspectives and purposes of those doing the telling, but the essential narrative remains consistent. Frank Sinatra refused to accept discrimination against his musicians and forced one of America's most prestigious hotels to reverse policies that had been enforced for years. The lessons that emerge from this story extend beyond the specific circumstances to encompass broader questions about solidarity, power, and the obligations that those with influence carry toward those without. Frank's willingness to sacrifice significant income to defend four musicians demonstrated values that his performances alone could not have communicated, character revealed through crisis that ordinary circumstances would have concealed. The musicians whose dignity was defended that day carried the experience throughout their lives. Their understanding of their own worth, enhanced by evidence that someone powerful had considered them worthy of defense. The psychological impact of the vindication they experienced complemented the practical benefits of accommodations that they would have been denied without intervention. The Fontainebleau Hotel that witnessed the confrontation has been renovated and transformed multiple times since 1961, its current configuration bearing limited resemblance to the establishment where Harrison Whitfield attempted to enforce segregation that Frank Sinatra refused to accept. The physical changes have obscured the history that the building contains, but documentation preserves knowledge of what occurred there. The La Ronde room where the performances took place has been repurposed according to changing entertainment preferences, the showroom format that had dominated mid-century nightlife giving way to alternatives that reflected evolving tastes. The space where audiences witnessed performances charged with the day's dramatic events no longer hosts similar programming. The story continues to be told because it addresses questions that remain urgent, about how those with power should respond when they witness injustice, about the solidarity that people across racial lines can demonstrate when circumstances require it, and about the changes that become possible when individual action aligns with collective movements toward equality. Rest in peace, Francis Albert Sinatra. The voice that filled showrooms with music, that moved audiences, also spoke for those whose voices were silenced by discrimination that treated them as less than fully human. What you did at the Fontainebleau in March 1961 proved that some artists recognize their obligations extend beyond performance to encompass the dignity of the people who make their performances possible. Harrison Whitfield learned that lesson at the cost of his career, and the hospitality industry learned it through publicity that demonstrated the consequences of discrimination when the person being discriminated against has powerful friends. The four musicians whose treatment you refused to accept never forgot the moment when someone with power used it on their behalf, and their story continues to inspire those who believe that solidarity can overcome injustice when it is genuine rather than merely rhetorical.